I'm Gabriel Sanders. I direct the public programs here at the museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our discussion tonight of civil rights after Ferguson with Darryl Pinckney and Stosh Cotler. I'm sure you've all heard about Selma, the drama starring David Oyelowo chronicling Martin Luther King's history-making march from Selma to Montgomery. The film has become a critical darling, earning that rarest of distinctions, a nearly perfect Rotten Tomatoes score, 99% fresh. As it happens, one of the few dissenting voices came from the Jewish weekly The Forward, which ran an article criticizing the film for minimizing Jewish contributions to Dr. King's fight. The charge did not go unanswered. Many criticized the article for its myopia and cultural narcissism. But the piece was nevertheless a good representation of how many Jews, and not only Jews, see the history of the civil rights movement. It's often a vision informed by smugness, self-satisfaction, and complacency. As our immediate past demonstrates, gaping inequalities persist, and there is much that remains to be done. Our two speakers today have both written stirringly on Ferguson and its implications. With Martin Luther King's birthday just a few days away, it seemed the perfect time to have them join us. Darryl Pinckney, a longtime contributor to the New York Review of Books, is the author of a novel, High Cotton, and most recently of the book Blackballed, The Black Vote and U.S. Democracy. The Washington Post ran a very flattering review of the book the other day, calling it timely and essential. Stosh Cotler is the chief executive officer of Bend the Arc, a Jewish partnership for justice. The Forward, which is not always off base, included her on its most recent list of the 50 most influential Jews in America. I'm going to ask you to silence your cell phones. It's my pleasure to say that the museum's public programs are made possible through a generous gift from Mrs. Lily Safra. And with that, please join me in welcoming Darryl Pinckney and Stosh Cotler.
Thank you for coming. This kind of frigid evening usually fills me with self-pity, and I think, I'm not going anywhere, so it's very nice that you came. Hello.
Hi. And hi. How are you all doing?
Good.
Good.
So, I'm not familiar with Bend the Arc. Just tell me a little bit about what you do.
Yes, I'd love to. So, Bend the Arc, a Jewish Partnership for Justice, is the country's leading progressive national organization that focuses exclusively on domestic public policy. So we work on issues ranging from immigration reform to voting rights to LGBT equality to income inequality. And at this very moment, we're also very active in this emerging and quite invigorating racial justice movement that we have seen, and we're both following very closely and participating in, that was sparked by some of the events in Ferguson.
Okay, so I'll just make some general remarks, and hope I don't sound foolish or contradict myself too badly. I went to Ferguson, and it's been a long time since I've lived in the United States, and I thought it would be okay to come back in the time of Obama. I forget what Maddox Ford said, which is, New York is not America. And I have to say that St. Louis struck me as a rather bleak place. And I realized that I forget how segregated America still is, residential segregation. And once where you live is segregated, everything else follows. Mm-hmm. Schools, your social interactions. It seems really bizarre that in the 21st century, we still don't really meet one another. And I find the idea of the public an endangered notion in and of itself. There are just fewer places where we meet and where we are, where we share a common identity. And so in Ferguson, I kept thinking about Occupy Wall Street and how the young in that movement sort of restored certain things to public discourse, principally that civil disobedience and nonviolence is still a very viable political tool. In Ferguson, even though there were these riots, that not only could anyone have predicted them, but some people counted on them to show that, the black youth of America are lawless and in need of firm policing. Because the night that it was announced that there would be no grand jury indictment in the Michael Brown case, the police were already protecting the shopping centers in white neighborhoods, but there were no police in the areas where blacks shopped, places that had been the scenes of trouble through the summer. So it was clear what was going to happen, and it did. And even though that happened, the moment still belonged to nonviolence. The movement that I saw that felt like the beginnings of something. They were interested in direct actions like shutting down highways, blocking shopping centers, interfering with flights at the airport. But all of this was kind of mass civil disobedience, lying in the streets, that kind of thing. And I sort of thought that it's like the early days of something like SNCC and the lunch counter sit-ins of the 1960s, when these very few sort of brave interracial groups would undertake these actions. And so I felt rather heartened by it. I feel rather pessimistic in the short term, but hopeful in the long run. I interviewed a black policeman, a week ago, and I sort of realized cameras on the police are not going to do any good. There's no such thing as better training for policemen. Most policemen never use their weapons. Most policemen don't want anything to happen because the first thing that then happens to them is that they're taken off the streets, they're put on desk jobs, their peers don't want to work with them, they're regarded as liabilities and targets, and they can't make overtime anymore. So they lose a lot of money if they're involved in incidents, things like that. But this guy, this former detective, was describing an incident from the mid-90s when he worked in the narcotics division in Washington Heights here in New York City. And he and his partner saw a black guy going down the street, in the middle of the street, walking very purposefully, striding, carrying a gun, swinging a gun, walking down the street, this look on his face, and they were sure he was going to go shoot someone. And they called him, he saw them, took off running, they chased him, eventually cornered him in an apartment building vestibule. After a standoff, he surrendered, by which time there was a considerable crowd. The crowd was very angry toward the policeman, saying things like, our children are here in this neighborhood. How dare you run through our neighborhood with your guns drawn? And he said he was very hurt and very angry himself, because as far as he was concerned, he'd stopped a shooting from happening in this neighborhood, and they only saw him as a danger, not as sort of a protection. But the more he spoke, I realized, well, he's trained like any white policeman, really. That, if I said, well, why is there sort of more, why are there more arrests in the city rather than the suburbs when there's more marijuana consumption in the suburbs, no doubt, than in the city? And he said, well, there are fewer cops, or people are outside, whereas in the suburbs they're sort of at home, and things like that. And so I thought, nothing's going to happen now. It is happening now, but we won't see the results, that it's a sort of generational thing, and that the young are very different. And this may include the young who are joining the police force now, that they won't have the same kind of sort of racial profiling training, or just sort of accepting it as the way things are done. Maybe the long term holds something else. It's just an example of trying to sort of see how we can sort of move forward. I still believe in the United States and a secular society. I think Obama's been a success. I don't think anyone's going to give him any credit, but considering how things were when he first took office, we're rather lucky to have him. In Ferguson, the young were very skeptical about voting, and they were sort of saying, we've been voting enough and look how little it's done. But actually, we're not voting enough. We don't turn out at midterm elections. Only white guys over 55 who make more than $77,000 turn out at midterm elections. And so it always ends up that the midterm is almost a nullification of the presidential, because we don't sort of stay in the field. And I think that may also be changing. But having been in Ferguson and then seeing Selma, it makes me think that something is still going on, and that there's still much that could be done. Yeah, I've rambled enough.
That was great. I feel like I actually have questions from all parts of what you said.
Really?
So I'm going to respond and then ask you some questions.
Okay.
If that's all right. So.
I'm just going to wipe the sweat from my brow.
Okay, I know, under the lights. So to me, I just finished this last week, one of the memoirs of Congressman John Lewis, who was, of course, one of the most formidable leaders of SNCC, and absolutely has committed his entire life to militant nonviolence and the idea of the promise of America and the fight for dignity and equality for not only Black communities, but for all people living in this country and beyond. And I couldn't help, when I was reading the memoir, I started the memoir in this moment where this racial justice movement was bubbling up, but it was actually a little confusing for me, because as I was reading this memoir, I couldn't tell how much I was projecting the past into the current moment, and how much the current moment was actually a direct legacy of the past, or actually where the differences are. And I'd love in a moment to talk with you about what you, as someone who's studied this civil rights history, think of as the places of continuity and the places of real distinction. When I look out at what's happening across the country right now, I'm often actually filled with despair at the state of our world. And as a Jew who believes that the Jewish imperative, our ethical mandate, is to heal and repair the world, that is what it means, that is the central reason for me that I define myself as a Jew, I have in my past felt a degree of both cynicism and heartbreak at the possibility of what it will actually take to not just make tweaks around the edges, but actually to transform the society in which we live. And for some reason, this racial justice moment that's unfolding before our eyes, that is characterized by now over 150 days of constant street presence and public pressure, to me, it feels like there's something quite tangible that is giving me the kind of hope that I actually have not felt in my entire life. So I was born in 1968 and have been politically active since I was a teenager, and there has not been a time in my adult life that I have not identified as an activist in some way. And yet this moment feels different to me in terms of the possibility for something that is truly revolutionary. And some of the characteristics that give me that sense of possibility, and of course it's new. So this is perhaps the moments that in 10 years we'll look back on this year and say, okay, this is where we could see some of that DNA forming. But to me, in addition to the reality on the ground that this is a multiracial struggle, but with very clear and powerful leadership from Black community leaders. And not only that, that these Black leaders are young and that they are LGBT identified, many of them. And that I actually think is groundbreaking. And the intersectionality, that's a real, like, that jargon. Do you guys know when I say intersectionality what I mean? No. So intersectionality is often now batted around political terminology when people's identities, when we hold multiple identities. So I am a woman, I am also a queer person. I come from a family where my father was very working class, lower working class. My mother was very upper middle class. I grew up in a mixed class family. Those are, and I'm a Jew, and I'm a number of other things. So that means I have an intersectionality of identities that are always at play when I move through the world. And these young people in Ferguson and beyond who are taking powerful action are putting this complexity of their multiplicity of identities at the center of what it means to think about transforming the world. And that, I think, that's been happening in politics for a long time, but the scale in which that embodied intersectional way, I think that that's actually changing what this movement looks like. And to me, having young queer people of color, young queer Black people, helping define what this movement looks like gives me just incredible optimism. So that's one of the things that I feel just so happy about. I also think that this ability to put forward a nonviolent protest movement is incredibly powerful. And I don't want to discount the role that Occupy played and continues to actually play in our society and throughout the world. I think it did some very radical framing and shifting. But one of the things that I think has been so positive about what we've seen is that there are some extremely clear and cogent and very comprehensive demands that have come out of Ferguson Action and Black Lives Matter, and that those demands are actually doable. They're actually winnable. They're winnable at the policy level, they're winnable at the administration level, and they're winnable at the cultural level if there is the commitment and the desire to put to jump in on it. They're totally doable, and they're so brilliant. So to me, it feels like those elements are they're striking to me. They give me a sense of inspiration that is also translating into some change that I see happening on the immediate front. The fact that the president, they have been so powerful that the president has been called to speak out publicly on this. That's huge. I mean, any of us who've done organizing in any context knows that usually, like, you work for decades before you have the president talk about the issues that you're working on. And I think in addition, there's something powerful happening that has been happening, but this feels like a tipping point where many Americans now are connecting the dots. And so in this particular instance, where as communities of color in general, but the Black community in particular, have never been unaware of the negative and extremely dangerous consequences of systemic racism, from slavery to slavery to Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow. White America, I think, is waking up and connecting the dots in a different way. And I think that we are now having a national conversation that a number of people are talking about how the system is rigged, and that the people who already have more power in the rigged system continue to abuse that rigged system and don't still get held accountable. And this is happening, I think, economically, where we've seen at the level where people are having a conversation on the economy and how the economy is rigged to negatively impact poor and working class and just middle class Americans, and the people who are benefiting from the economy are continuing to do illegal actions, and there's no accountability. And in this case, this racial justice movement, we see a rigged system of mass incarceration, of police brutality, of school to prison pipeline, and the very people who are at the helm of those systems of power abusing that system still and not being held accountable. Police officers not actually being questioned about whether their actions are legal, illegal, and not being, the conversation you had with Cornel West, he said this brilliant quote, which is, the criminal justice system is criminal, which I think holds some truth. So I'm feeling very excited about the moment. But I'd love to ask you again, what do you see as either the same as what we've seen in the past, and that we ought to be taking those lessons learned and applying them to now? And I think also being in a Jewish, I don't know that everyone here identifies as Jewish, but thinking also about how Jews may or may not have played a role in the past, and what do you see that's different now about the racial justice movement that's emerging, and what could be possible for the Jewish community in playing an additive role?
Okay. Well, if you bear with me, I'll sort of ramble again.
I just did, so.
When I watched Selma, I was very struck that 1965 was only 20 years after the end of World War II. And I remember when I was a child, World War II seemed like really a long time ago. I can remember being carried back from the drive-in after watching The Guns of Navarone, and it seemed really a long time ago. I'm from the Midwest, from Indianapolis, Indiana, and in the school district where I lived, the white kids who were your friends, I mean, everyone was very nice, and they were very curious and rather happy to have a Negro classmate, but the ones who were your friends were Jewish. They asked you home because they didn't know any better, or their parents were survivors, or just a different sort of family tradition, or they went out of their way to try to make you feel welcome because at one time they'd been the strangers in this school district as well. My parents were very active in civil rights, so their colleagues were either black professionals or Jewish professionals. And so I've always assumed that blacks and Jews work together. We're on the same side. It's just the faith I grew up in. I can remember a professor of mine, actually she was a great writer, named Elizabeth Hardwick, once said she came to New York to be a New York Jewish intellectual. And I understood what she meant, and I came to New York for sort of the same purpose, but also probably to go to gay bars without my parents knowing. And I can remember being, sort of on campus and the tail end of these discussions that question the Black-Jewish alliance. This kind of late black nationalism that black students adopted that was sort of suspicious of white alliances and things like that. And there was this mad book that was very much discussed at the time, but probably little read, called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual by Harold Cruse. And it really was a rant and sort of faulted Marxism for thwarting the growth and development of black nationalism and black nationalist ideas. And of course, for Cruse, not of course, but for Cruse, Marxism in America was this Jewish-dominated movement. I don't know what one could say about that. But after you were born, 68, things like that, this reaction set in. And actually, we've been living under this reaction since Nixon. There may have been Carter and there may have been Clinton and so forth, but we've been living with this kind of neocon world for a long time. And the problem the neoconservatives really have is that they resent the prestige of liberal ideas. That in a way, the Constitution and what it means to be an American still is on the side of a liberal social vision. And the neoconservatives went out of their way, especially under Reagan, to try and denigrate the 60s, liberalism, and all the stuff that came out of there. Any black intellectual you heard of in the 80s and the 90s who wasn't Cornel West or Skip Gates was someone from the Hoover Institute or things like that who, was going to sort of prove what an individual black he was by knocking the civil rights movement and that kind of thing. The nice thing about Obama, among the nice things about Obama, is neoconservatives don't understand he looks like he should be one of them, but he's not. He has all the credentials to be the kind of black guy who succeeded and leaves all that behind, but he's not. Someone who went to high school with him once explained to me, well, everyone in Hawaii is a mongrel. She herself was an Okinawan Japanese, so it didn't matter. But once Obama got to Los Angeles and the policeman treated him as a black youth, he understood what his mother had been trying to tell him all those early mornings in Indonesia when she would make him get up and sort of read black history. And it's never gone away. It's something he got from his white mother, not from his African immigrant father who was just passing through. And so I find this rather moving, that this brave woman was in some ways the vessel or carried this black identity for her black son until he was ready. And then she sort of gave it to him. And now with Obama and all of that, in a very subtle way, the neoconservative critique has dropped away and been sort of silenced because it just doesn't work. It doesn't fit what's going on. And one thing Occupy did was to bring into the mainstream a subject we couldn't find a way to talk about anywhere. No one would sort of let it in, which was income inequality, wealth inequality, Thomas Piketty, and all that sort of thing. They brought that in, and once you can start talking about that, other things follow. I'd say the difference now, of course, is that back then in 1965, the United States was an ever-expanding economy. And so the Great Society was part of the generosity of an affluent society. All this has happened, and now we'll share this with others or make it possible for others, or this is the way you can reach the American dream. We don't have that feeling of infinite possibilities anymore economically. If anything, there's a slight feeling in the air that the drawbridges are going up, and you don't want to be stuck out in the cold with the poor. So it's a different sort of mood in that way. You're entirely right that the youth who are leading Black Lives Matter, and I forget the other umbrella organization, but the things that have come out of Ferguson are these young black queer women, white queer guys. They're not shy about identifying themselves in these terms in the way that, of course, 50 years ago nobody would. Even in the film Selma, it's still, as much as it wants to do certain things, it's still a work of piety. You cannot show King cavorting in a hotel room. You can't show the license that the movement brought to a lot of people, or that they felt they lived under, or just how nuts people were. I saw in one memoir, I can't remember where it was, everyone was getting laid. I think it was part of the freedom of the moment, but I think it was also part of the fear of those times. Because, when you look back, it's like the French Resistance, we were all in the French Resistance. No, you weren't. Most of you were, turning in your Jewish neighbors. not everyone was in the civil rights movement. Most black ministers were afraid to have Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. There was no certainty how things would turn out. People were very sort of nervous. So a lot of stuff went on. And of course, the position of women in the civil rights movement, women were the grunts of the revolution. They were expected to make coffee, to put up the chairs, to keep the organizations going, but they were not in the leadership positions. Yeah. Not a single woman spoke at the March on Washington in 1963. Right. And it was Bayard Rustin, a gay guy, who really kind of blocked women from speaking.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Bayard Rustin is a hero of mine, but, he said that, they're already represented because they're such a part of these organizations, but, they weren't, again, in leadership positions. Right. And all that has changed 50 years later. And it's this social sea change. It's like smoking. Nobody smokes anymore. It seems like it happened overnight. But just at the same time, marriage equality seems to have happened overnight, whereas 10, 20 years ago, it seemed a long way off. So all these things are helping the young who are now in the racial justice movement. And also, that because it is so queer, in a way, it keeps it interracial. That you don't have macho militants saying, these sort of poses and things like that. You don't have, for all this stuff that it's still white policemen picking on black males, you don't get a macho response. Even the hip hop of 20 years ago seems somewhat obsolete, that kind of aggression. You don't have that now. But I think the biggest change is just the sense that everyone shares in an endangered world. And in order to plan the future, we have to get a hold of our sanity, our collective sanity. Yeah. I think that's the big difference.
Yeah.
Did any of that make sense? No. Well, you're standing around, you try to think about these things, and then you say, well, I'll go cook instead. I don't cook, so.
I don't either. At all.
I don't cook at all either.
That's for another conversation. Well, it makes me reflect on what's changed in the Jewish community as I think that there is, let me just start by something that is really important to say in this conversation, which is Jews of color are a big part of our community. And Black Jews are experiencing this racial justice movement and moment as people who are direct targets of racism and who have this experience directly, and they're experiencing it as Black people in America. And often I have heard in the Jewish community our conversations and our narrative and even the way we set up the way to think about how we engage in this movement as being in solidarity. And I think that when we even use words like the Jewish community will be in solidarity with this Black Lives Matter movement or the racial justice movement, it invisibilizes the Black Jews in our community and the Jews of color in our community who experience racism. And so that to me is something that I've actually seen in a really, really interesting and important way bubble up, especially in the Jewish social justice space. The Jewish social justice organizations, there is a very profound conversation happening about what we must do to address racism in our community and how the lack of formal leadership of Jews of color in the Jewish community, in the Jewish social justice community, but in the Jewish community in general, is creating some incredible discomfort. And I think it's a very important discomfort. It's the kind of discomfort that you learn from and is really a kick in the pants, because if we did as a community actually support the leadership and the success and the thriving of Jews of color in our community spaces, we as a community would probably have a very different response to this racial justice moment than we're having now. I'm not saying that we're having a bad response, but it would look different because we would have different voices in the conversation and we would have a different set of experiences in thinking about how we ought to respond and how we could respond. So that's a piece. that I think there were Jews of color that existed in the civil rights movement, certainly, and now, 50 years later, there are more Jews of color in our community. Our community is changing demographically, just as the communities in the United States are changing demographically, racially, and ethnically. And so that's something that I think is unique for us to be paying attention to as Jews. I also think that if I were to fabricate, make up 3 archetypes of potential Jews that could have been at the March on Washington, for example, and I'm sure that there's complexity in even trying to caricature these people. I think that there were probably Jews who were participating because they felt that this civil rights movement they were participating because they felt discriminated against. They were discriminated against. They were experiencing what it meant to live in somewhat of a second-class citizenry, not being able to attend certain schools, not being able to live in certain neighborhoods, not being able to attend certain clubs, certainly in a very different way than Black people and other communities of color experienced discrimination. But I think that there was one set of Jews who probably participated because they felt like, I'm doing this out of my own direct self-interest. I could also imagine there were Jews who were participating because they were seeing this as a class struggle. So your comment about Marxism, and we know that there were many Jews at that time who identified as socialists, as communists, who were participating in the movement because they saw this as being in solidarity with other people who were poor or who were struggling for economic justice, and that it was taking a racialized mode, but they were there in part because of their ideology, their political ideology. And then I also think that there were Jews who were participating because we come from a prophetic tradition that states very clearly that we are made in the image of God, and that we have been strangers and we know what oppression feels like directly, historically, and that we carry an impulse within us that compels us to continually fight this fight for the underdog, whether that underdog is us or that underdog is another community under siege. And so when I think about that time, that demographic of our community has changed pretty profoundly, I think. We don't have as many Jews who are publicly identifying as socialists or communists right now. We don't see as many Jews who are acting out their social justice impulses because they feel like they have a direct self-interest. It's more of an enlightened self-interest, if you will, like I do my social justice work because I understand that there's still injustice and I must do it, but not because I feel personally like my life is being negatively affected by many of these systems. And then I think that there are still Jews, thankfully, who feel called by the prophetic wisdom tradition that we have inherited. What also feels different is that at that time, Jews were still building our power as a community. We were still very close to the Holocaust. We were still a community, I would say, living through trauma and shock. And at this point in time, I think that that shock and trauma actually still is very alive in our community and plays itself out in some very profound ways that I hope we as a community continue to examine and continue to heal from. But what's changed significantly is that we have continued to become a much more affluent, much more integrated, much more educated, and much more politically powerful community than we were 50 years ago. And we now have Jews who sit on the Supreme Court. We have Jews who are in the Senate, Jews who are in the House. We have Jews who are leaders in every major sector: business, finance, philanthropy, arts and culture. And that's not to say that Jews run the world, and there is that horrible stereotype that I think we have to stay aware of and fight against. And we cannot shirk the responsibility that we now have with the privilege that we have gained through the opportunity and the prosperity that this country has showed us. And if we are not continuing to leverage the power and relationships that we hold, then in my opinion, we are not acting Jewishly, that we are That to me, this is the central challenge and the central opportunity of what it means to be Jewish in 21st century America. And so what I hope we see in our community is, again, a real recognition and an embrace that we have Jews of color who are our community, that this racial justice struggle is our community's struggle for the Jews of color who are in our community. And for those of us like myself who are white Jews and who have a significant amount of privilege and power at this moment, that we use that power for good, that we leverage that power for the common good, and that we are as bold and courageous and risk-taking as we can be, as we have the capacity to be, that we have seen ourselves be in the past, and that we have not been for a very long time. And it is, it's a shanda, it's a shame that for many of us, the last serious iconic image that we have of our community is a picture of Rabbi Heschel marching with Reverend Dr. King. That image is everywhere, and it's actually a profoundly beautiful image. Or the image of Rabbi Joachim Prince speaking before Dr. King at the March on Washington. Those are such beautiful moments in Jewish history and our legacy that we shouldn't discount or not feel a sense of connection to. But it's not acceptable that those images are from 50 years ago. And we must ask ourselves what we are doing today to ensure that we are creating new images of what it looks like for the Jewish community to show up appropriately, powerfully, and effectively in this racial justice moment.
Well, I can't think of any Jewish abolitionists. There were Jewish slaveholders, but there were a few black slaveholders as well. In North Carolina, for instance, Jews, like free blacks, couldn't own dogs or shotguns, and they had to wear a patch.
Right.
And they couldn't vote till 1860, and of course, then North Carolina wanted them to vote for secession. And then, as we talked once before, the 19th century immigration from Eastern Europe and Russia, that was a whole sort of different population of Jews, disliked by the German Jews, we're always told. Okay, fine. But they brought this experience of persecution, and that had an immediate effect on the political character of what we assumed were sort of Jewish politics, and probably why so much of it fed into the socialist and communist movements. Because Dr. King had Jewish advisors, in particular Stanley Levinson, a Jewish businessman who had been a member of the Communist Party USA, that Hoover went to then Attorney General Robert Kennedy and said, King is a tool of the communists, we need a wiretap. And he was very reluctant to approve this wiretap, but Hoover sort of got it. It was because of this kind of Jewish-black coalition that the forces of reaction were sort of very nervous and sort of didn't want it to happen. We remember that of the three civil rights workers who were murdered in Mississippi, 2 were these Jewish students. Right. So, that's who was going to the South, these freedom riders. They were Jewish kids, but also Protestant kids from homes with a tradition. I think the civil rights movement then and the racial justice movement now remind us that religion and politics in the American tradition hasn't always been right-wing.
Right.
That's a very important thing to reclaim.
Yeah.
I sometimes think of that moment in Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus, which is a novella I adore and read it every year. It's a really perfect book. Anyway, Nathan is sort of looking out from his library steps in Newark and wondering, what's the population? He sees that the blacks have replaced the Jews. And he wonders, who's going to replace the blacks in this kind of way that immigrants sort of move on to better things? And the answer's not given, but of course now you go to Newark, they're all Portuguese. Okay, fine. and actually Goodbye Columbus is about assimilation and what happens to Jewish culture under the pressures of assimilation. One of the many bad things about Reagan, of course, is that a lot of the neoconservative politics were articulated by Jews who had become disillusioned with liberalism, or was their shtick, this is what they said. And so it went with the kind of feeling of Jews having arrived, that these sort of the Irving Kristals and the Bill Kristals and all these people were going to get positions in the Reagan government.
Yeah.
That, it sort of represented full achievement of sort of Jewish possibility in America. Yeah. And then, we never talk about it, and I know it's a domestic group, but of course the sense of what Israel is and its relation to the Palestinians has had an effect on Black Jewish discussion in the United States. And we can't pretend that it hasn't, and be wrong to, in a way. So I think all of that is there. I think that I always think of, I'm like one of these people who sort of says, well, my best friend was Black. I always go back to my best friend in junior high school, and I just remember him saying, we don't believe in heaven. We think it's important what you do here on earth. That's why everybody's doing all this stuff. And I always think of that, and to me, that is the essence of Jewishness. I don't know about Judaism, but for me, the essence of Jewishness is just this kind of, God is watching, do the right thing. I never think about Black Jews, I'm sorry to say, after sort of all the Seders and everything.
Yeah.
I just don't. I don't know why. And I do sort of, for a long time, Detroit has this growing Arab population. It's huge. And they never wanted to have anything to do with Blacks in the NAACP. But after 9/11, the Arab leaders in Detroit called up the Black leaders and said, now we understand what you mean about racial profiling. How do we help? And that kind of thing. So I think that if you're saying, where is the Jewish presence or part it could play in the racial justice movement, I think that you have to acknowledge that it's always been a divided community in America. Not every Jewish person does come from a radical or liberal tradition. But they don't seem like real Jews to me. I don't think of Norman Podhoretz as a real Jew.
Right.
It's my problem, I know.
It's not just your problem.
I like white liberals. I like Jewish liberals. They seem to me real. And a conservative Jew, I just think, you don't make any sense. In the same way, I look at a sort of Black guy who thinks he doesn't have to be identified or care about sort of the Black stuff anymore. So it could be my problem, just not letting people be free of me. But, I think that your real identity as a Jew, your real identity as an African American is always going to be on the side of liberal feeling.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a sort of cultural betrayal.
Yeah. I hear you. Can I ask
Just
you? I'd love to hear you talk about the role you see, the relationship and the role you see between voting and voting rights and this current racial justice movement. And you can take that wherever you want it. But
the young are very skeptical about voting, but voting hasn't been given its full chance. The low turnout in midterm elections has been a problem in America since 1843. No one can explain it, though everyone has theories. But I sort of feel that the answer now is that, of course, we must show up for everything, no matter how small. The right wing did, the Christian right did, but now sort of, liberals tend to think, oh, the victory's won, now we can go home, or we can have a party. There's not that kind of sticking to it. But also in America, involvement in local politics, not everyone has the time or the economic ability. In Ferguson, a city council, no, in St. Louis County, the council people get $11,000 a year. So it means the only people who can be on the city council are people who already have money.
Right.
You're not going to get a grassroots person because it's just not enough money. So it's very hard to be involved in local politics and things like that. But there's no other way, that everything has to count, everything has to matter. There are these studies that in schools, if the teachers know the parents, the students do better. And that's the parents showing up at the school and sort of saying, I'm here, et cetera, things like that. It's just a degree of involvement that, none of us wants to make, but that's why these things ask something extra of us, more time or, do inconvenience yourself for freedom, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, lots of other things. And as you said, it's all sort of doable where the political will released. I believe it's there, it's just blocked at the moment. But we can pay teachers more. Absolutely. And I believe in the National Teachers Union. I'm not, I think teachers get a really bad deal, and they're the most important people in our society, really, As Alfred North Whitehead once said, you cannot learn unless you fall in love with the source of learning. And so the teachers are very important, and, things like that. A jobs bill, because our public infrastructure is falling apart. Sort of do things like that. I think that's what should come out of Ferguson. Not just more voting, but more voting for specific projects.
Right.